First Maccabees, chapter 1. Everything began with the conquest of Alexander the First, son of Philip the Macedonian. Setting out from Greece, he killed Darius, king of the Persians and the Medes. Being already king of Greece, he took the throne of Darius. After fighting many battles, conquering strongholds, and putting to death the kings of those nations, he reached the ends of the earth and plundered several nations. And when the world became quiet and subject to his power, he became proud. He gathered a strong army, ruled over provinces and nations, and rulers paid him taxes. But he fell sick, and knowing he was going to die, he summoned his generals and the noble men who had been brought up with him from his youth, and while still alive, he divided his kingdom among them. Alexander had reigned for 12 years when he died. His generals assumed power, each one in the region assigned to him. And immediately after Alexander's death, they made themselves kings and their sons after them, filling the earth with evil for many years. From their descendants, there came a godless offshoot, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus, who had been held as hostage in Rome. He became king in the 137th year of the Greek era. It was then that some rebels emerged from Israel who succeeded in winning over many people. They said, "Let us renew contact with the peoples around us, for we had endured many misfortunes since we separated from them." This proposal was well received, and some eagerly went to the king. The king authorized them to adopt the customs of the pagan nations. With his permission, they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem in the pagan style. And as they wanted to be like the pagans in everything, they made artificial foreskins for themselves and abandoned the holy covenant, sinning as they pleased. When Antiochus felt confident of his power, he decided to seize Egypt and rule over the two nations. He entered Egypt with a strong army, with chariots of war, elephants, horses, and a great fleet, and attacked Ptolemy, king of Egypt. Ptolemy had to retreat and was defeated, and many of his men died. The victors seized the fortified cities of Egypt and plundered the land. In the year 133, when Antiochus returned after defeating Egypt, he passed through Israel and went up to Jerusalem with a strong army. He arrogantly broke into the sanctuary and removed the golden altar, the lampstand for the light with all its accessories, the table for the bread of offering, the libation vessels, the cups, the golden censers, the curtains and the crowns, and stripped away all the decorations, the golden moldings that used to cover the temple entrance. He also took possession of the silver, gold, valuable objects, and all the hidden treasures he could find. He took everything with him and left for his country, after shedding much blood and making arrogant statements. There was great mourning throughout the land of Israel. The leaders and the elders groaned, young men and maidens lost courage, and women grew pale. Bridegrooms sang lamentations, and the young bride wept in her marriage bed. The earth quaked in sorrow for its inhabitants, and all the people of Jacob were humiliated. After 2 years, the king sent to the cities of Judah the chief tax collector, and he came to Jerusalem with a strong army. He spoke to the people with words of peace in order to deceive them, But when he had gained their confidence, he suddenly fell on the city and dealt it a terrible blow, killing many Israelites. He plundered the city, burning and destroying the palaces and the surrounding walls. He took women and children captive and seized the livestock. Then they rebuilt the city of David with a high and solid wall protected by strong towers, and this became their fortress. There they set evil men and apostates who defended it. They stored up weapons and provisions and everything they looted in the city, posing a constant threat. It became an ambush for the sanctuary, a grave and constant threat to Israel. They shed innocent blood around the sanctuary and defiled the sanctuary itself. The inhabitants of Jerusalem fled because of them. She became a colony of strangers and was a stranger to her children who abandoned her. Her sanctuary became empty as the desert. Her feasts became days of mourning. Her Sabbaths were ridiculed, and her fame became an object of contempt. As her glory had been great, so now was her dishonor, for her greatness was turned into grief. Antiochus issued a decree to his whole kingdom. All the peoples of his empire had to renounce their particular customs and become one people. All the pagan nations obeyed and respected the king's decree, and even in Israel many accepted the imposed cult. They offered sacrifices to idols and no longer respected the Sabbath. The king sent messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah to carry the decree which imposed strange customs. In accordance with it, burnt offerings, sacrifices, and other offerings in the sanctuary were suppressed. It also ordered that Sabbaths and sacred feasts be like ordinary days. The sanctuary and its ministers were no longer to be regarded sacred. Instead, altars, sacred enclosures, and temples were to be dedicated to idols. They were to offer pigs and unclean animals in sacrifice and not perform on their sons the rite of circumcision. To sum up, they were to defile themselves by all kinds of impurity and profanity in order to forget the law and change all their customs. The decree finally declared, anyone who does not fulfill the king's order shall die. The king published this obligation throughout the province, and inspectors appointed by him went around the land of Judea. They saw to it that sacrifices were offered in all cities. Many Israelites joined them, abandoned the law, and committed countless evils, obliging the true Israelites to find places of refuge to hide themselves. On the 15th day of the month of Kislev, in the year 145, Antiochus erected the abominable idol of the invaders on the altar of the temple. Pagan altars were built throughout the whole land of Judea. Incense was offered at the doors of their houses and in the squares. There wicked men tore up the books of the law they found and burned them. They killed anyone they caught in possession of the book of the covenant and who fulfilled the precepts of the law as the royal decree had ordered. And being men in power, they pursued the Israelite rebels they found month after month in the cities. On the 25th day of every month, they offered their sacrifices on the new altar they had built upon the altar of the temple. The women who, in defiance of the decree, had the rite of circumcision performed on their children were put to death with their babies hung around their necks. Their families and all who had taken part in the circumcision were also put to death. But in spite of all this, many Israelites still remained firm and determined not to eat unclean food. They preferred to die rather than to make themselves unclean with those foods prohibited by the law that violated the holy covenant, and Israel suffered a very great trial. First Maccabees, chapter 2. In those days, Mattathias, son of Simon, a priest of the family of Joarib, left Jerusalem and went to settle in Modain. He had 5 sons: John, known as Gadi, Simon, called Tasi, Judas, called Maccabeus, Eleazar, called Avaran, and Jonathan, called Apphus. Mattathias saw the blasphemies committed in Judah and Jerusalem. So he said, "Alas, was I born just to witness the ruin of my people and the destruction of the holy city? Shall I sit by while she is in the hands of her enemies and her sanctuary in the power of foreigners? Her temple has become like a dishonored man. The precious objects that were her glory have been carried off as booty. Her babies have been murdered in the squares, and her young men killed by the sword of the enemy. What nation has not received part of her treasures and taken possession of her spoils? She has been stripped of all her adornments, and from the freedom that was hers, she has gone into slavery. Our beautiful sanctuary, that was our pride, has been laid waste and profaned by pagans. What is there to live for?" Mattathias and his sons tore their clothes, put on sackcloth, and went into deep mourning. In the meantime, the king's representatives, who were forcing the Jews to give up their religion, came to Modain to organize a sacred gathering. While many Israelites went to them, Mattathias and his sons drew apart. The representatives of the king addressed Mattathias and said to him, "You are one of the leaders of this city, an important and well-known man, and your many children and relatives follow you. Come now and be the first to fulfill the king's order, as the men of Judah have already done, and the survivors in Jerusalem as well. You and your sons will be named friends of the king, and the king will send you gold, silver, and many other gifts." But Mattathias answered in a loud voice, "Even if all the nation included in the kingdom should abandon the religion of their ancestors and submit to the order of the king Antiochus, I, my sons, and my family will remain faithful to the covenant of our ancestors. May God preserve us from abandoning the law and its precepts. We will not obey the orders of the king, nor turn aside from our religion, either to the right or to the left." When he finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of everyone to offer incense on the altar that was built in Modain according to the king's decree. When Mattathias saw him, he was fired with zeal. His heart was stirred, and giving vent to his righteous anger, he threw himself on the Jew and cut the man's throat on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's representative, who was forcing the people to offer sacrifice, and then tore down the altar. In doing this, he showed his zeal for the law, as Phinehas had done with Simri, son of Salu. Mattathias then began to proclaim loudly in the city, "Everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant, come out and follow me." Immediately, he and his sons fled to the mountains and left behind all they had in the city. Many Jews who looked for justice and wanted to be faithful to the law went into the desert. They took with them their children, wives, and livestock, because life had become unbearable for them. Then the king's representatives and the authority in the city of David in Jerusalem were informed that some men had disobeyed the king's order and had gone to hide in the caves in the desert. A strong force of the king pursued and overtook them. They surrounded them and prepared themselves for an attack. It was the day of the Sabbath. And they said to the Jews, "Enough of this. Come out and obey the king's order if you wish to save your lives." But they answered, "We will neither come out nor obey the king's order to violate the day of the Sabbath." So they attacked them at once. But the Jews did not defend themselves, nor did they try to close the entrance of their place of refuge. They said, "We shall die with a clear conscience, but heaven and earth will remember that we were murdered." The king's men attacked them on that Sabbath, and they all died, men and women, children, a total of more than 1,000, not counting the livestock. When Mattathias and his friends came to know what happened, they went into deep mourning. They said to one another, "We cannot do as our brothers and sisters have done. We shall fight against the pagans to defend our life and our customs. Otherwise, they will quickly destroy us." On that day, they resolved to defend themselves against anyone who attacked them on the day of the Sabbath, and not let themselves be killed, as had happened with their people in the hiding place. At that time, a group of Hasidians, the devout, valiant Israelites, who devoted themselves sincerely to the law, joined them. All those who wanted to escape from oppression joined them, and in this way they grew strong. They succeeded in forming an army. Then they began to pour their anger and indignation onto the sinners and renegades. These men had to flee to other lands for safety. Mattathias and his friends made expeditions during which they destroyed the altars, imposed by force the rite of circumcision on the children they found uncircumcised, and pursued all the arrogant. The undertaking prospered in their hands. They defended the law against foreigners and their kings, and subdued the renegades. When Mattathias neared his death, he said to his sons, "Now the insolent and the violent are in power. It is a time of upheaval in which God releases his anger. So, my sons, be zealous for the law, and risk your lives defending the covenant of our ancestors. Remember the deeds our ancestors fulfilled in their time, that you too may have fame and glory. Remember Abraham, who proved himself faithful in the hour of trial, and how God held him to be a righteous man. Joseph, at the time of his misfortune, observed the commandment of God, and so became the Lord of Egypt. Phinehas, our ancestor, because of his great zeal, received the priesthood for himself and for his sons forever. Joshua became head of Israel because he carried out God's command. Caleb received his inheritance in this land because he had proclaimed the truth before the assembly. And David was given a lasting kingdom because of his devotion. Elijah, because of his zeal for the law, was taken up into heaven. Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael were saved from the flames because of their faith. Daniel was rescued from the lion's mouth because of his righteousness. Consider then that in any generation, those who trust in God are never defeated. Do not fear the threats of an impious man, for his glory shall end in dung and worms. Today he is exalted, but tomorrow he shall perish. He shall return to dust from where he came, and nothing shall remain of his plans. Have courage, my sons, and remain steadfast in the law, for in this you will receive glory. I know that among you Simon is a man of sound judgment. Listen to him, and he shall take your father's place. Judas Maccabeus has been valiant from his youth. Let him be your general and conduct the war against foreigners. Now, all those who fulfill the law to join you and defend our people, retaliate against the pagans and fulfill the ordinance of the law. Now, call all those who fulfill the law to join you and defend our people, retaliate against the pagans and fulfill the ordinance of the law. Mattathias blessed them and then went to join his fathers. He died in the year 146, and they buried him in the tomb of his fathers at Modain, and all Israel mourned him deeply. First Maccabees chapter 3. Mattathias' son Judas Maccabeus succeeded him. His brothers and all who had followed his father gave him their support, and they continued the war with determination. Judas made the name of his people more famous. He put on his breastplate and girded himself with the armor of war like a giant. He fought many battles and protected his camp with his sword. He was like a lion when he attacked, like a lion's whelp roaring over its prey. He pushed the renegades in their secret places and consigned to the flames those who troubled his people. All the renegades feared him, all evildoers were confounded, and liberation was accomplished through him. Many kings feared him, while the people of Israel rejoiced in his deeds. His memory shall be blessed forever. He went through the cities of Judah, utterly destroying the impious, and saved Israel in their trial. His fame resounded to the ends of the earth for having gathered those about to perish. Apollonius also gathered together men from the pagans and a good number of Samaritans to fight Israel. When Judas learned of this, he went out to meet him in battle. He defeated and killed him. Many of the enemy fell, and the rest fled. They seized the plunder, and Judas took the sword of Apollonius, and from then on he always used it in battle. Seron, the commander of the Syrian army, learned that Judas had gathered many men and that the whole community of believers was at his side. He thought, "This is now the opportunity for me to make myself famous and become an important man in the kingdom. I will go to fight Judas and his men who do not obey the king's order." So he did, and a strong army of pagans went up with him to help him to take vengeance on the children of Israel. As Seron approached the slope of Beth Horon, Judas went out to confront him with a small company of warriors. But on seeing the enemy advancing against them, Judas' men said to him, "How can we, few as we are, fight against so many? And besides, we feel weak, for we have not eaten anything today." But Judas declared, "A multitude shall easily fall into the hands of a few, for heaven can win over equally well with the help of many or of few. Victory does not depend on the number of those who fight, but of heaven which gives us strength. They come against us, moved by their pride and lawlessness, to seize us and take possession of our wives and children, and to take everything away from us. But we are fighting for our lives and our loss. God will crush them before us, so do not be afraid." As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly rushed against the enemies. Seren and his army were defeated. They pursued them down the slope of Beth Horon to the plain, and about 800 of Seren's men fell, and the rest escaped to the land of the Philistines. With this, fright and fear of Judas and his brothers seized the pagans who lived around them. The fame of his name reached the king, and the pagan nations recounted his battles. When this news reached King Antiochus, he was furious. So he ordered all the forces of his kingdom to assemble, for he had a powerful army. He opened his treasury and paid the troops a year's salary, ordering them to be prepared for any eventuality. But he found that the money in the treasury had run short, for the taxes of the provinces had decreased due to dissension and disaster, which he himself had caused in the land by changing the laws that were in force from the earliest days. He feared that, as before, he would not have enough funds for his expenses and for the gifts he used to give more lavishly than preceding kings. So great was his need that he decided to go to Persia to collect the taxes from those provinces and raise considerable funds. Then he left Lysias, a noble man from the royal family, in charge of the affairs of government from the river Euphrates through the Egyptian frontier, and with the responsibility of educating the king's son Antiochus until his return. And he turned over to Lysias half of his troops with the elephants and gave him instructions about his policies. On matters dealing with the inhabitants of Judea and Jerusalem, Lysias was to send an army to destroy and crush the defenders of Israel and all who remained in Jerusalem, and to wipe out even the memory of them. Then he was to have foreigners settle throughout the Jewish territory and distribute the land to them by lot. The king took with him the remaining half of the army and set out from Antioch, the capital of the kingdom, in the year 147. He crossed the river Euphrates and went through the upper provinces. Lysias chose from among the friends of the king Ptolemy, the son of Dorymenes, Nicanor, and Gorgias, all influential men. With them he dispatched 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry to the Judean province to destroy it as the king had ordered. They marched out with their troops and encamped on the plain near Emmaus. The merchants of the region heard of their arrival, so they went to the camp with large amounts of silver, gold, and fetters, proposing to buy the Israelites as slaves. The Syrian army and those from the province of the Philistines also joined the troops. Judas and his brothers understood that the situation was becoming worse because the enemy had encamped in their territory. So when they learned of the king's order to destroy and crush the people, they said, "Let us uplift our people from their miserable situation and fight for them and for the holy place." The whole community assembled to prepare for war, and they prayed and asked God for mercy and compassion. Like a desert, Jerusalem was left without inhabitants. None of her children went in or out. The temple was profaned, and foreigners lived in the holy city, which had become a dwelling place for the pagans. There was no more rejoicing for Jacob. No flute or zither was heard. So they gathered and went to Mizpah opposite Jerusalem, because Mizpah had been a place of prayer for Israel. They fasted that day, put on sackcloth, sprinkled ashes on their heads, and tore their garments. They opened the book of the law to look for an answer to their questions, just as the pagans consulted the images of their gods. They brought the vestments of the priests, the first fruits and the tithes, and they brought to the Nazarites who had completed the days of their consecration. They cried aloud to heaven and said, "What shall we do with these people, and where shall we take them? For your sanctuary has been trampled on and profaned. Your priests are in mourning and are humiliated. And now the pagans have gathered together to destroy us. You know what they are plotting against us. How can we resist them if you do not come to help us?" Then they sounded the trumpets and made a great outcry. After this, Judas appointed officials to lead his people, leaders of 1,000 men, leaders of 100, of 50, and of 10. Then he told those who were building houses, those about to marry, those who were planting vineyards, and those who were afraid, to return to their homes, as the law allowed. Next, the army marched out and encamped to the south of Emmaus. Judas told them, "Prepare your weapons, be valiant, and be ready to fight in the morning against those foreigners who have joined forces to crush us and remove our holy place from this land. It is better to die fighting than to live and see the misery of our nation and of the holy place. May heaven's will be done in everything." 1 Maccabees chapter 4. Gorgias took with him 5,000 infantry and 1,000 picked cavalry and moved out by night to fall upon the Jews and take them by surprise. He had asked men from the citadel to guide his troops. But Judas learned of this, so he went out with his men to attack the king's army in Emmaus, while the enemy troops were still dispersed outside the camp. Gorgias arrived at the camp of the Jews by night, but found no one there. He then began to search for them in the mountains. He thought, "They are running away from us." But at daybreak, Judas appeared in the plain with 3,000 men who had not the armor or swords they would have liked. They saw the camp of the pagans with its strong fortifications and the cavalry surrounding it, all trained men in war. Judas said to his men, "Do not fear the number of the enemy or be afraid of their attack. Remember how our ancestors were saved at the Red Sea when Pharaoh's army pursued them. Cry out to God, for if he so wishes, he will remember his covenant and destroy that army before us this very day. And all the nations will know that someone saves and liberates Israel." The pagans looked up and saw the Jews coming down against them. So they came out of their camp to face them in battle. Judas had the trumpet sounded, and his men attacked. The pagans were defeated and fled to the plain, but all the rear guard fell by the sword. They pursued them to Gassara, to the plains of Idumea, of Asor, and Jamnia, and killed about 3,000 of the enemy. When Judas and his army stopped chasing them, he said to the men with him, "Do not think of the booty now, for another battle awaits us. Gorgias with his army is in the hills close by. Remain ready to fight them, and afterwards you can gather the plunder with nothing to worry about." He had barely finished speaking when an army detachment appeared on the hillside. These men saw that their own troops had fled and their camp had been destroyed, for the smoke that rose up from the camp was enough to tell them this. So they were terrified, and when they saw the army of Judas drawn up on the plain ready for battle, they fled to the land of the Philistines. So Judas and his men returned to plunder the camp. They carried off valuable booty, and on their return they sang and praised heaven, for he is good and his mercy is eternal. The day was a great victory for Israel. The pagans who had escaped went to Lysias and told him what had happened. When he heard this, he was dismayed and depressed because things in Israel had not gone as expected, and he had not carried out the king's command. The following year, he organized an army of 60,000 men and 5,000 cavalry to confront the Jews. They advanced into Idumea and encamped at Bethsur. Judas came out with 10,000 men to meet them in battle. When he saw their military strength, he prayed, "Blessed are you, Savior of Israel, who broke the warrior's strength by the hand of your servant David, and handed over the camp of the Philistines to the power of Jonathan, son of Saul, unto his armor-bearer. In the same way, give this army into the hands of your people Israel, and let the confidence they place in their power and in their horses be destroyed. Fill them with fear, shatter their confidence in their own strength. May they be defeated and recover no more. Deliver them to the sword of your faithful people, so that all who know you may praise your name." Both sides attacked, and 5,000 men from the army of Lysias fell dead. Lysias saw that his army was disheartened, while Judas and his men grew bolder and were ready to live or die nobly. So he retreated to Antioch, where he recruited mercenaries to strengthen his army, for he planned to return to Judea. Then Judas and his brothers said, "Our enemies are defeated, so let us go up and purify the holy place and consecrate it again." And all the army assembled and went up to Mount Zion. There they found the sanctuary abandoned, the altar profaned, the gates burned, bushes growing in the courtyard as in a forest or on a mountain, and the rooms destroyed. They tore their garments and wept bitterly. Some sprinkled ashes on their heads, while others prostrated themselves on the ground. They sounded the trumpets and cried aloud to heaven. Then Judas chose men to fight against the defenders of the citadel until he had purified the temple. He chose blameless priests who showed great zeal for the law, and had them purify the temple and bring the stones of the abominable altar of the pagans to an unclean place. They held a council to decide on what should be done with the altar of the holocaust which had been defiled, and they decided to destroy it, so that shame brought about by the pagans might not remain with it. They deposited the stones of the said altar in a covenant place on the temple hill until a prophet should appear to settle the matter. Then they took uncut stones as the law prescribed and built a new altar like the former one. They repaired the sanctuary and the interior of the house and consecrated the courts. They made new sacred vessels and brought in the lampstand, the altar of incense and the table. They burned incense on the altar and lit the lamps on the lampstand, and these began to shine in the temple. They placed the bread on the table and hung up the curtains, bringing to completion all that had been decided. On the 25th day of the month of Kislev, in the year 148, they arose at dawn and offered the sacrifice prescribed by the law on the new altar of holocaust which they had built. It was precisely at that time and date that pagans had profaned it before, but now they consecrated it with songs accompanied by cithars, harps, and cymbals. All the people fell prostrate and blessed heaven that had given them happiness and success. They celebrated the consecration of the altar for 8 days, joyfully offering holocausts and celebrating sacrifices of thanksgiving and praise. The front of the temple was adorned with crowns of gold and shields. The gates and the rooms had been restored and fitted with doors. There was no end to the celebration among the people, and so the profanation of the temple by the pagans was forgotten. Finally, Judas, his brothers, and the whole assembly of Israel agreed to celebrate the anniversary of the consecration of the altar annually for 8 days, from the 25th of the month of Kislev, in high festivity. At that time, they built around Mount Zion high walls and strong towers to prevent the pagans from coming in to occupy it as they had done before. Judas stationed a garrison there to defend it. He also fortified Bethsur so that the people might have a fortress against Idumea. 1 Maccabees chapter 5. When the pagans who lived around them 1 Maccabees chapter 5. When the pagans who lived around them learned that the altar had been rebuilt and the temple restored as before, they became very angry. They determined to destroy the descendants of Jacob who lived among them. So they began killing and driving away the Jews. That is why Judas declared war against the sons of Esau in Idumea and the province of Akrabaten, for they surrounded Israel. That is why Judas declared war against the sons of Esau in Idumea and in the province of Akrabaten. That is why Judas declared war against the sons of Esau in Idumea and in the province of Akrabaten, for they surrounded Israel. He dealt them a mortal blow. He humbled them and looted them. Then he remembered the wickedness of the gangs of Bayan, who were a plague and a permanent source of trouble for the Jews with their ambushes on the roads. So Judas, after blockading and besieging them in their towers, took an oath to exterminate them. He then burned the towers with all who were inside. From there, he crossed over to the land of the Ammonites, where he encountered a large and well-organized army under the command of Timotheus. He engaged them in many encounters, defeated them and crushed them. He attacked and captured the city of Yazer with its neighboring villages and then returned to Judea. The pagans of Gilead gathered together to destroy the Israelites who lived in their territory. But the Israelites took refuge in the forest of Dathama and sent a letter to Judas and his brothers, which said, "The pagans around us have joined forces to crush us. and are now preparing to storm the fortress where we have taken refuge. Timothy is their leader. Come at once and rescue us from their hands, since many among us have already died. All our brothers living in the land of Tobias have been murdered, their women and children taken captives. About 1,000 men have been killed. They were reading this letter when other messengers arrived from Galilee, tearing their garments as they gave this message. The people of Ptolemais, Tyre, Sidon, and the whole of heathen Galilee have united to destroy us. When Judas and his men heard this news, they summoned a great assembly to determine what could be done for their brothers and sisters in distress who were fighting for their lives. Judas said to his brother Simon, "Choose your men, go and free our brothers in Galilee. I and my brother Jonathan go to Gilead." He left the rest of the troops under the command of Joseph, the son of Zechariah, and Azariah, a leader of the people, to defend the land of Judea, and gave them this order: "Remain at the head of the people, but do not attack the pagans until we return." 3,000 men were assigned to Simon for the campaign in Galilee, and 8,000 men to Judas for Gilead. Simon left for Galilee and defeated the pagans in many encounters and pursued them to the gates of Ptolemais. About 3,000 of the pagans fell, and Simon seized their spoils. Then he took away with him the Jews who were in Galilee and Arbata, as well as their women and children, and all they had, and brought them into Judea with great rejoicing. Meanwhile, Judas Maccabeus and his brother Jonathan crossed the Jordan and journeyed through the desert for 3 days. There they encountered the Nabateans, who received them in a friendly way and told them all that had happened to their brothers in the region of Gilead. They gave them the news that many Jews were imprisoned in Alema, Caspo, Makir, and Kamaim, all large and fortified towns in the vicinity of Bosra and Bosor. They also related that Jews were also blockaded in other cities of Gilead, and that the pagans had decided to attack their strongholds on the following day, intending to destroy all of them in one day. Judas quickly turned off with his army by the desert road to Bosra. He occupied the city, put all the men to the sword, seized the booty, and then burned the city. He left the place at night and advanced until they reached the fortress. At dawn, the Jews locked up and saw an innumerable army carrying ladders and engines of war to attack and capture the fortress. Judas saw that the attack had begun. From the city, an uproar rose up to heaven with shouts and trumpet blasts. He said to his men, "Let us now fight for our brothers." Then he divided his troops into 3 groups and attacked the enemy from behind, sounding the trumpets and praying out loud. When the army of Timothy recognized that it was Maccabees, they began to escape. But Judas dealt them a heavy blow, and about 5,000 of the enemy fell that day. From there, Judas went to Alema. He attacked and occupied the city, killed all the men, and seized the booty, and then he burned the city. From there, he captured Caspo, Makir, and Bosor, and the remaining towns of Gilead. After these events, Timothy gathered a new army and encamped opposite Raphon at the other side of the stream. Judas sent men to explore the camp, and they brought back the following information. All the pagans of this region have joined forces under Timothy, forming a powerful army. They have also hired Arab mercenaries as auxiliaries, and they are now encamped at the other side of the stream, ready to attack you. So Judas set out to confront them in battle. Timothy saw that Judas was approaching the stream with his army, so he said to the captains of his troops, "If he crosses first and advances against us, he shall attack us with such a great force that we will not be able to withstand him. But if he hesitates and encamps at the other side of the river, then we shall cross over to attack and defeat him." When Judas reached the banks of the stream, he assigned the officials of his men along the stream and ordered them, "Do not let anyone pitch his tent. All are to fight." Judas was the first to cross to the enemy, and all his men followed. They defeated all the pagans who threw down their weapons and took refuge in the sacred enclosure of Karnaim. But the Jews captured the city and burned the sacred enclosure with everyone inside. So Karnaim was crushed, and no one was able to withstand Judas. Judas gathered together all the Israelites from the region of Gilead, small and great, their women and children and their belongings, an immense multitude, to take them into the land of Judea. They reached Ephron, a strong and important town situated by the road. It was impossible to go around it either to the right or to the left, so they were forced to go through it. But the inhabitants entrenched themselves inside and blocked the entrance with stones. Judas sent them a message of peace, saying, "Allow us to go through your land as we go back to ours. We will simply walk through, and none of us will do you any harm." But they refused to open the gates to him. So Judas gave orders to his army for everyone to take up his position where he was. The men of war took up their positions, and Judas attacked the city all day and night until it fell into his hands. He put all the male inhabitants to the sword, razed the city, and took its plunder. Then they passed through the city over the bodies of the dead and came to the great plain after crossing the Jordan opposite Bethshan. Throughout the journey, Judas kept on encouraging his people and rallying those who fell behind until they reached the land of Judah. They went up to Mount Zion joyfully and well contented, and they offered holocausts because they had returned safe and sound without losing a single man. While Judas and Jonathan were in the land of Gilead, and their brother Simon was encamped in Galilee opposite Ptolemais, Zechariah's son Joseph and Azariah were in command of the army. When they heard of their exploits and how well they had done in battle, they said, "We also have to win renown, so let us go and fight the pagans who live around us." So they gave orders to their army to march against Jamnia. But Gorgias came out of the city with his men and attacked them. Joseph and Azariah were defeated and pursued as far as the borders of Judea, and about 2,000 Israelites fell that day. The people suffered this great defeat because the Jewish commanders did not listen to Judas and his brothers, thinking they themselves were capable of great deeds. They did not belong to those to whom the deliverance of Israel had been entrusted. They did not belong to those to whom the deliverance of Israel had been entrusted. The valiant Judas and his brothers were greatly honored in Israel and became famous among the foreigners who heard of them, and many came to congratulate them. Judas with his brothers went to the Negev to fight the Edomites. He seized Hebron and its villages, demolished its walls, and burned its defending towers. Then he left for the land of the Philistines, passing through Marisa. That day, some priests who wanted to be valiant fell because they imprudently attacked the enemy. From there, Judas turned towards Azotus in the land of Philistines. He destroyed their altars, burned the statues of their gods, plundered the city, and then returned to Judah. First Maccabees, chapter 6. When King Antiochus was making his way through the upper regions of Persia, he received news about Elymais, a city renowned for its wealth in silver and gold. They kept in the wealthy temple of their city golden armor, breastplates, and weapons left there by the Macedonian king Alexander, the son of Philip, the first sovereign of the Greeks. So Antiochus went there, but the inhabitants came out armed against him when they learned of his intention. So his attempt to take the city failed. He had to turn back, and he returned much embittered to Babylon. While he was still in Persia, it was reported to him that the armies sent to Judea had been defeated. They told him that although Lysias had gone with a strong army, he had to flee before the Jews, who had been strengthened with the weapons and the abundant booty taken from the neighboring armies. He heard too that the Jews had destroyed the abominable idol he had erected on the altar in Jerusalem and had rebuilt the temple walls to the same height as before, and had also fortified the city of Bethsur. When he received this news, he was terrified and deeply upset. He fell sick and became greatly depressed because things had not turned out the way he had planned. So he remained overcome by this terrible anguish for many days. He felt that he was dying. So he called his friends and said to them, "Sleep has fled from my eyes, and I am greatly crushed by my anxieties. And I keep on asking, why such grief has come upon me? I who was generous and well loved when in power, and now I am so discouraged. Now I remember the evils I did in Jerusalem, the vessels of gold and silver that I stole. The inhabitants of Judea I ordered to be killed for no reason at all. I now know that because of this, these misfortunes have come upon me, and I am dying of grief in a strange land." The king then summoned Philip, one of his friends, and appointed him administrator of his whole kingdom. When he had entrusted him with the crown, robe, and signet ring, with the charge of educating his son Antiochus and preparing him for the throne. Antiochus died there in the year 149. As soon as Lysias learned of the king's death, he proclaimed his son Antiochus as his successor, for he himself had trained him from childhood and had named him Eupator. The men from the citadel were blockading the Israelites around the temple and did not let an opportunity pass of harming them on behalf of the pagans. Judas decided to wipe them out, so he gathered together all the people to besiege them. The troops assembled and laid siege to the citadel in the year 150, building firing platforms and siege engines. But some of the besieged broke through the blockade and together with renegade Israelites went to tell the king, "How much longer will you wait to do us justice and avenge our brothers? We took the side of your father, we obeyed his orders and observed his laws. The result is that the citadel is now besieged by our own people, and we are treated as foreigners. All of us who were caught have been killed, and they have seized our property. And they are fighting not only against us, but in the neighboring lands as well. Right now, they are encamped against the citadel in Jerusalem to capture it, and they have fortified the temple and the city of Bethsur. If you do not take the lead now, they will do greater things, and then you will not be able to control them." The king was enraged when he heard this news, and he summoned all his friends, the generals of the army and the commanders of the cavalry. From other kingdoms and islands of the sea, he recruited mercenary troops. His force numbered 100,000 infantry, 20,000 horsemen, and 32 elephants trained for battle. They came through Idumea, besieged Bethsur, and attacked for days using engines of war. But the besieged made a sortie and burned their engines and bravely kept up their resistance. Then Judas ceased fighting at the citadel and encamped at Beth Zechariah, opposite the camp of the king. Early in the morning, the king rose, and his army boldly advanced along the road to Beth Zechariah. The troops prepared for battle and sounded the trumpets. They showed juice of grapes and mulberries to the elephants to arouse them for battle, and distributed them among the battalions. 1,000 men in coat of mail and bronze helmet lined up at the side of each elephant. A cavalry of 500 picked horsemen went before each elephant and accompanied it with the order not to separate from it. A strong wooden tower was fixed to each elephant by means of leather straps, and 4 warriors, including the driver, were on the tower. The rest of the cavalry were stationed on the right and left flanks of the army to harass the enemy and protect the battalions. When the sun shone on the shields of gold and bronze, the mountains glittered and gleamed like flames of fire. One part of the king's army was deployed up in the mountains and the other on the plain. All advanced confidently and in good order. The Jews trembled when they heard the great noise of this vast multitude, the marching of the mass, and the clanking of their weapons. It was indeed an army extremely numerous and powerful. Nevertheless, Judas and his army advanced to give battle, and about 600 men of the king's army fell. Eleazar, called Avaran, saw one of the beasts protected with armor, which excelled all the others, so he supposed that it must be the king's. He then sacrificed himself to save his people and win eternal renown for himself. He boldly charged towards the animal right into the midst of the battalion, killing men right and left, scattering the enemy before him on both sides. He reached the elephant, darted in under it, and stabbed it in the belly. The elephant collapsed on top of him, and he died on the spot. The Jews, however, aware of the tremendous force of the king's army and their bravery, retreated before them. The king's troops went up to Jerusalem to overtake them, and the king encamped in Judea and around Mount Zion. He made peace with the people of Bethsur, who evacuated the city, since they had no food to continue the resistance, for that year was a year of rest for the land. The king seized Bethsur and stationed a garrison there to guard it. He encamped before the temple for a long time and set up firing platforms, crossbows, engines, fire throwers, catapults, scorpions to discharge arrows, and slingers. The defenders also constructed engines as their attackers had done, and they fought for a long time. But they had no food in storage, as it was the 7th year, and because the Israelites who came to Judea from the pagan lands had consumed the last of their reserves. So few men were left in the temple because of the famine. The others had dispersed. Meanwhile, Philip, to whom King Antiochus during his life had entrusted the education of his son Antiochus to prepare him for the throne, had returned from Persia and Media with the army that had accompanied the king to those regions, and was planning to seize power. This is why Lysias hastily gave orders to depart, saying to the king, the generals of the army and the soldiers, "We are losing strength every day. We are short of food, and the place we are besieging is well fortified. We are moreover diverting our attention from the affairs of the kingdom. Let us then offer the hand of friendship to these people and make peace with them and with their nation. Let us permit them to live according to their customs as before. Since all this came to be because we suppressed their laws, and they have risen in defense of them." These words pleased the king and the generals, so the king sent messengers to make peace with the Jews, and the Jews accepted it. When the king and the generals had committed themselves with an oath, the Jews came out of the fortress. The king went up to Mount Zion, and when he saw the defenses, he broke his oath and ordered the surrounding wall to be demolished. Then he hurriedly left and returned to Antioch, where he found Philip already in control of the city. So he fought him and took the city by force. 1 Maccabees, chapter 7. In the year 151, Demetrius, the son of Seleucus, escaped from Rome. He sailed with a few men to a port of the kingdom, where he arrived and proclaimed himself king. As soon as he entered the kingdom of his fathers, the army arrested Antiochus and Lysias to hand them over to him. When Demetrius heard this, he said, "I do not want to see their faces." So the army executed them, and Demetrius took the throne. At once, all the Israelites without law or religion came to him. They were led by Alcimus, a man who sought the office of chief priest for himself. And they began accusing their own people before the king. Judas and his brothers, have murdered all your friends and have driven us away from our land. Send one of your trustworthy friends to see the havoc they have caused us and our province which belongs to the king. Let him punish all who support them. The king chose Bacchides, one of his friends and a distinguished man of the kingdom, the governor of the western province of the Euphrates. He also sent with him Alcimus, whom he had appointed chief priest, and ordered them to punish the Israelites. They set out with a large army. On reaching Judea, they sent messengers to Judas and his brothers with treacherous proposals of peace. But the Jews, who knew that they came with a powerful army, did not trust them. However, a commission of teachers of the law met with Alcimus and Bacchides to seek a satisfactory solution. These men from the group of the Hasidians, the first to seek peace in Israel, reasoned like this: a man in the line of Aaron has come with the army. He will surely deal with us in fairness. Bacchides, moreover, sent them a friendly message and assured them under oath, "We do not wish any harm to you and your friends." They believed him, but he arrested 60 of them and executed them the same day, according to the word of the scripture. Around Jerusalem they have scattered the dead bodies of your saints. They have shed their blood, and there was no one to bury them. All the people were terrified and feared them. They said, "There is no justice or truth in these people who have violated the agreement they made with an oath." Bacchides left Jerusalem and encamped at Bethsur. From there, he ordered the arrest of many prominent men who had deserted him, as well as some of the people, and he had them thrown into a deep pit. Then he placed the province in the hands of Alcimus, leaving him with an army to help him, and he returned to the king. Alcimus struggled to have the Israelites recognize him as chief priest, and all who disturbed the peace of the people joined him. They became masters of the land of Judea and did great harm to the Israelites. Judas saw that Alcimus and his men were an even greater menace to Israel than the pagans had been. So he went throughout the territory of Judea to do justice to those traitors and to prevent them from going about the country. Alcimus realized that Judas and his men were of greater strength and that he could not resist them, so he returned to the king and accused them of serious crimes. The king then sent Nicanor, one of his more illustrious generals and a known enemy of Israel, with the mission to utterly destroy these people. Nicanor reached Jerusalem with a large army. He sent Judas and his brothers false messages of friendship, saying to them, "Let us not begin as enemies once more. I will come with a few men to meet you face to face in friendship." He indeed came to Judas, and they greeted each other peaceably, but the enemy was prepared to seize him. Judas was told that Nicanor had come to him treacherously, so he withdrew from Nicanor and would not see him again. When Nicanor saw that his plans had been discovered, he went out to look for Judas, and this time to fight him. He found him near Kafar Salama. About 500 of Nicanor's men fell, and the rest fled to the city of David. After these events, Nicanor went up to Mount Zion and some of the priests and elders came out of the temple to greet him peacefully and show him the sacrifice they offered for the king. But he mocked them, he scorned and insulted them, and angrily swore this oath: "If you do not deliver Judas into my hands immediately, as soon as I have destroyed him, I will return and burn this temple." And he went away furious. The priests entered the temple, and they stood weeping before the altar and the sanctuary. They said, "You, Lord, chose this house, that your name may be invoked in it, that it may be a house of prayer and petition for your people. Take vengeance on this man and on his army. Let them die by the sword. Remember their insults and do not delay in punishing them." Nicanor left Jerusalem and encamped in Beth Horon, where the Syrian army joined him. Meanwhile, Judas encamped in Adasa with 3,000 men and prayed, "Lord, when the messengers of the king of Assyria insulted you, your anger came and killed 185,000 of his men. So now crush this army before us, so that all the rest may know that this Nicanor has blasphemed against your temple. Judge him according to his wickedness." The two armies met in battle on the 13th of the month Adar. Nicanor's army was defeated, and he himself was one of the first to fall in the battle. When his troops saw that he was dead, they threw down their weapons and fled. The Jews pursued them a day's journey from Adasa to the entrance of Gazaria, sounding the trumpets as they followed them. The people came out from all the neighboring villages of Judea and surrounded the fugitives, forcing them to return to defend their lives. So all fell by the sword, not even one of them was left. Then the Jews seized the plunder and booty. They cut off Nicanor's head and the right hand he had so arrogantly stretched out, and they displayed them at the entrance of Jerusalem within sight of all. The people were elated and celebrated their victory annually on the 13th of the month Adar. The land of Judah enjoyed peace for a short time. 1 Maccabees chapter 8. In the meantime, Judas was informed about the Romans. He was told that the Romans were valiant in war and that they showed goodwill towards all who sided with them, that they offered friendship to all who approached them and were a strong ally in war. He was told of their wars and of their exploits among the Gauls, whom they conquered and forced to pay taxes, and of all they had done in Spain to gain possession of the silver and gold mines, and how they had conquered that land by dint of intelligence and perseverance, despite its great distance from their own land. He also learned how they had defeated the kings who came from the ends of the earth to attack them, how they managed to conquer and crush them. There were others who paid them an annual tax. They had defeated and subjected Philip and Perseus, the kings of Macedonia, and others who opposed them. They had vanquished Antiochus the Great, king of Asia, who went to fight the Romans with 120 elephants, cavalry, chariots, and a very strong army. But he was defeated and fell into their hands. He and his successors were forced to pay an enormous amount in tax, to surrender hostages, and to cede some of their best provinces like India, Media, and Lydia, which afterwards the Romans gave to King Eumenes. The Greeks had planned to come and destroy the Romans, but hearing of it, the Romans sent a single general against them. They killed a great number of Greeks, took their women and children, destroyed their fortresses, and enslaved them to this day. In the same way, they also destroyed and subdued other countries and islands, as well as others who opposed them. But they have usually remained faithful to their allies and to those who relied on them. The Romans were really powerful. They conquered kingdoms far and near, and all who heard their name feared them. They appointed as kings those who were to their liking and deposed those who were not. But in spite of all this, not one of them had himself crowned or dressed as a king in order to be exalted. They had created a senate, and 320 men deliberated on daily matters relating to the good of the people and the maintenance of order. Every year they would choose one man to rule over them and govern the empire, and all obeyed him without envy or jealousy. So Judah sent Eupolemus, the son of John, and Jason, the son of Eleazar, to Rome, entrusting them with a mission to make a covenant of friendship with the Romans. Since the Greeks treated the Israelites as slaves, Judah hoped to liberate them from oppression in this way. The envoys from Judah went to Rome, where they arrived after a long journey. When they entered the Senate, they addressed the assembly. Judas Maccabeus, his brothers, and the people of Israel have sent us to you to conclude a covenant of peace with you and to be numbered among your allies and friends. The Romans approved this proposal, and this is the copy of the letter they wrote on bronze tablets, which they sent to Jerusalem as a memorial of peace and alliance. May all go with the Romans and the Jewish people at sea and on land forever. May both sword and enemy be far from them. If war comes first to the Romans or to any of their allies in any part of its empire, the Jewish nation shall enter the war wholeheartedly as circumstances permit. The Jewish nation will not receive from them wheat or weapons or money or ships as Rome has decided. They must fulfill their obligations without a recompense. In the same way, if the Jewish nation is attacked, the Romans shall fight at her side with all zeal as circumstances may allow. The Roman allies will not receive wheat or weapons or money or ships as Rome has decided, but the Romans shall fulfill their obligations without deception. On these terms, the Romans conclude their alliance with the Jewish nation. If after these terms have taken effect, either party should wish to add or delete anything, the said party shall do so in common agreement with the other party. Then what has been added or deleted shall be binding. And concerning the harm King Demetrius does to the Jews, we have written to him as follows: Why do you lay such a heavy yoke upon the Jews, our friends and allies? If they complain about you again, we shall defend their rights and attack you by sea and land. 1 Maccabees, chapter 9. When Demetrius was informed of the death of Nicanor and the defeat of his army, he sent Bacchides and Alcimus back to Judea with the best troops of his army. They took the road to Galilee and besieged the city of Mesaloth in the Arbela region. They captured it and killed many. In the first month of the year 152, they encamped before Jerusalem. From there, 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry set out of Berea. Judas had his camp in Elasa with 3,000 picked men. When they saw the huge number of enemies, they were terrified. Many slipped out of the camp, and only 800 men were left. Judas saw the dispersal of his army, and this crushed his spirit. The battle was imminent, but he had no time to group them together. Yet in spite of being dismayed, he did his best to encourage those who remained with him. Let us fight our enemies. We may yet be able to defeat them. They tried to dissuade him. We cannot do anything now but save ourselves. We can come back later with our brothers and fight, but now we are too few. But Judas answered them, God forbid that I should run away from them. If our time has come, then let us die as valiant men for our brothers, without tarnishing our glory. The army of Bacchides marched out of their camp, while the Jews remained in their place to engage them in battle. The cavalry was divided into two wings. In the first line, the veterans in war advanced, and the archers and slingers followed. Bacchides was on the right wing. At the sound of the trumpets, they advanced on both sides. The Jews also sounded the trumpets, and the earth trembled with the noise of the armies, and a battle began, which lasted the whole day. Judas saw that Bacchides and the main strength of his army was on the right. The most courageous of the Israelites went with him, and they defeated the right wing of the enemy, pursuing them up to the hills. But when those on the left wing saw the right wing being defeated, they attacked Judas and his men from the rear. They fought bitterly, and many fell on both sides. Judas also fell, and the rest fled. Jonathan and Simon took their brother and buried in the tomb of their fathers at Modin. All the people of Israel mourned and wept for him for many days, repeating this lamentation, how the hero has fallen, he who saved Israel. The other deeds of Judas, his battles, exploits, and heroism were not written, for they were many. After the death of Judas, the renegades reappeared throughout the territory of Israel, and the evildoers took courage. At the same time, there was a severe famine, and the country went over to their side. Bacchides chose renegade men and made them masters of the land. These men traced and searched out all the friends and supporters of Judas and brought them before Bacchides, who punished and humiliated them in 1,000 ways. It was a terrible trial for Israel, such as had never been experienced since the disappearance of the prophets. So the friends of Judas came together and said to Jonathan, "Since your brother Judas died, we haven't found anyone like him to head the resistance against the enemy, against Bacchides and all the enemies of our nation. So we now choose you to take his place, to be our head and lead us in our wars." So from that day on, Jonathan accepted the leadership and succeeded his brother Judas. When Bacchides heard of this, he planned to kill Jonathan, but Jonathan was informed of the plot and fled to the desert of Tekoa together with his brother Simon and his followers. They encamped by the lake of As far Bacchus found this out on the Sabbath day, and with all his army crossed the Jordan. Jonathan had sent his brother John, representative of the people, to ask their friends, the Nabatean, to store for them their large amount of baggage. But the tribe of Yamri and the people of Medeba captured John and took all he had with him, then departed with the booty. After this had happened, Jonathan and his brother Simon were told that Yambrites were celebrating a solemn wedding and were escorting the bride, a daughter of one of the magnates, from Nadabath with great pomp. Both remembered the murder of their brother John, so they went up and hid under cover of the mountain. At a certain moment, they heard a confusion of sounds. Then they saw a great deal of baggage. The bridegroom, his friends and brothers came straight to them with tambourines, musical instruments, and many weapons. Then the Jews rushed down on them from their ambush and killed them. There were many casualties, and others fled to the mountain. Finally, the Jews seized all the plunder. So the wedding turned to mourning, and the music to lamentation. Having avenged the death of their brother, the Israelites went back to the marshes of the Jordan. Let us return to Bacchus. He arrived with a strong army on the Sabbath day at the banks of the Jordan. So Jonathan said to his men, "Courage, let us fight for our lives, for today things are going to be serious. Dangers surround us. We have the waters of the Jordan on this side, the marshes and the thickets on the other side. There is no place to turn. So cry out to heaven for deliverance from our enemies." And the battle began. Jonathan stretched out his arm to strike Bacchus, but he eluded him and withdrew. So Jonathan and his men leapt into the Jordan, swimming to the other side. But their enemies did not follow them. On that day, about 1,000 of Bacchus' men fell. Bacchus returned to Jerusalem. Then he began to build fortified cities in Judea, the strongholds of Jericho, Emmaus, Beth-horon, Bethel, Timnath, Pharathon, and Tephon, with high walls and barred gates, and a garrison stationed in each of them to harass the Israelites. He also fortified the cities of Bethsur, Gazara, and the citadel, and placed troops in each of them with supplies of provisions. He took the sons of the leaders of the land as hostages and imprisoned them in the citadel of Jerusalem. In the year 153, in the second month, Alcimus ordered the demolition of the wall of the inner court of the temple. This meant no less than destroying the work of the prophets. Alcimus did in fact begin the demolition, but soon after suffered a stroke, so the work was suspended. Alcimus was no longer able to speak, not even to rule over his household. After a while, he died in great agony. Because of his death, Bacchus returned to the king, and the land had peace for 2 years. Then all the renegades agreed on a plan. Jonathan and his people now live in peace without any fear at all. Let us bring Bacchus back. He can arrest them all in one night. They went to Bacchus, and when they had convinced him, he set out with a large contingent. He secretly sent letters to his supporters in Judea, instructing them to seize Jonathan and his men. But their plot was found out and their plan foiled. Instead, the supporters of Jonathan arrested 50 Jewish leaders of this conspiracy and had them executed. Jonathan and Simon then withdrew with their men to Beth-Basi in the desert. They rebuilt the ruins and fortified it. When Bacchides heard this, he assembled all his men and notified his adherents in Judea. He went to attack Beth-Basi, besieged it for many days, and built engines of war. Then Jonathan left his brother Simon in the city and went out into the countryside with a handful of men. He defeated Odomera and his brothers and the people of Pasiron in their camp. Then they turned back and began to attack the troops who had laid siege to the city. Meanwhile, Simon and his men went out of the city and burned the engines. They attacked Bacchides, who was defeated and dismayed by the failure of his expedition. He was greatly enraged against the renegades who had advised him to return to the Jewish country. He executed many of them and decided to return to his own land. When Jonathan learned this, he sent messengers to him to make a treaty of peace and to exchange prisoners. Bacchides accepted his terms. For Bacchides' part, he fulfilled his promises and swore that henceforth and until the day of his death, he would never harm him in any way. He turned over to Jonathan the prisoners taken earlier in Judea. Then he returned to his own country and never came back again to the territory of Judea. So there was peace in Israel, and Jonathan resided in Michmash, where he began to govern the land, and the renegades disappeared from Israel. Book of Maccabees, chapter 10. In the year 160, Alexander Epiphanes, son of Antiochus, sailed for Ptolemais and occupied it. He was well received and he began to reign. When Demetrius heard this, he assembled a very large army and marched out to fight him. At the same time, he sent a letter of friendship to Jonathan and offered him vast power. For Demetrius thought, "Let us make the first move in making peace with him before he makes peace with Alexander against us, remembering all the wrongs we have done to him, his brothers, and his nation." So Demetrius authorized Jonathan to organize an army and manufacture arms. He named him his ally and ordered the release of the hostages who were in the citadel of Jerusalem. Jonathan went at once to Jerusalem and read the letter before all the people and those in the citadel. They were afraid when they heard that the king had authorized Jonathan to organize a great army, and they released the hostages to Jonathan, who handed them back to their families. Jonathan resided in Jerusalem and began rebuilding and restoring the city. He commanded the builders to build the walls and the defenses of Mount Zion with hewn stones, and they did so. Then all the foreigners who stayed in the fortresses built by Bacchides began to flee, each of them abandoning his post and returning to his own land. Only at Bethsur did some who had abandoned the law and the precepts remain, since this was like a place of refuge. King Alexander was informed of the promises Demetrius had made to Jonathan. He was also given an account of the battles and exploits of Jonathan and his brothers and the trials they had endured. So Alexander declared, "Shall we ever find another man like him? Let us make him our ally and friend." And he wrote him a letter. "King Alexander, to our brother Jonathan, peace. We have heard of you that you are a valiant man and most worthy of our friendship. Therefore, We now appoint you high priest of your nation and bestow on you the title Friend of the King, he who sent him a purple robe and a golden crown. So we invite you to watch over our interests and maintain friendly relations with us. This is why, in the 7th month of the year 160, on the occasion of the Feast of Tabernacles, Jonathan put on the sacred vestments. He also recruited troops and manufactured a great quantity of arms. When Demetrius heard what had happened, he was greatly displeased and said, "What have we done that Alexander is ahead of us in gaining the friendship of the Jews? I will also write them kind words and promise them honor and gifts to win them to my side." So he wrote to the Jews, "King Demetrius greets the Jewish nation. You have kept your agreement with us and have remained our friends and have not joined our enemies. We have heard of it and so we rejoice. Therefore, continue to be faithful and we will grant you privileges in return for all you do on our behalf. I will free the Jews from many taxes and grant them royal privileges and exemptions. From now on and forever, I now free all Jews from payment of tribute, salt dues, and crown levies. I give up from this day and henceforth the third of the harvest and half of the fruit of the trees, which I have the right to exact from the region of Judea and the 3 districts annexed to it from Samaria and Galilee. From this day on and for all time, Jerusalem shall be a holy city and be free with all its territory, with the right to collect tithes and tributes. I also give up control of the citadel of Jerusalem and turn it over to the high priest, that he may choose the men he wants to defend it. I grant freedom without ransom to all the captives taken from Judea into any part of my kingdom. I free everyone from the taxes they owe me for their livestock. All feasts, Sabbaths, new moons, special days, and the 3 holy days before and after a feast shall be days of exemption for all the Jews in my kingdom. No one shall have the right to pursue or molest them for any motive whatsoever. I also decree that they may be accepted into the king's army to the number of 30,000 Jews, who shall receive the same salary as the rest of the king's forces. Some of them shall be stationed at the king's fortresses, and positions of trust shall be given to some of them. Their officers shall be chosen from among themselves, and they will live according to their laws, as the king has prescribed in the land of Judea. The 3 districts of Samaria annexed to Judea shall be considered part of Jewish territory. To avoid any conflict of power, these shall be subject to no authority other than that of the high priest. I give the city of Ptolemais and its territory as a gift to the temple of Jerusalem to cover the expenses of public worship. Henceforth, I will give 15,000 pieces of silver annually for the maintenance of the temple, which shall be taken from the royal revenues from appropriate places. Moreover, I give all that should have been paid to me by the administrators in previous years. In addition, I also remit the 5,000 pieces of silver levied every year from the tributes to the temple and give them to the priests in charge of public worship. Anyone who takes refuge in the temple of Jerusalem or in any of its enclosures because of his debt on royal taxes or because of any other debt shall not be disturbed, and his possessions anywhere in my kingdom shall be duly protected. Finally, the cost of rebuilding or restoring the sanctuary shall be passed on to the king's account, as well as the expenses of reconstructing the walls of Jerusalem, the fortification of its defenses, and the construction of the walls in the cities of Judea. When Jonathan and the people heard such proposals, they did not believe or accept them, for they remembered the great wrongs Demetrius had done to Israel and the ill treatment to which he had subjected them. They decided in favor of Alexander, for he was the first to propose peace, and they became his faithful allies. King Alexander assembled a great army and encamped opposite Demetrius. The two kings met in battle, and the army of Demetrius was routed. Alexander pursued him until Demetrius was defeated. The battle lasted until sunset, and on that day Demetrius died. Then Alexander sent messengers to Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, with the following message: I am now again in my kingdom, and have assumed power after defeating Demetrius and all his army. Now I occupy the throne of my ancestors as master of all the land. Let us be friends. Give me your daughter in marriage, and I will become your son-in-law, and I will give you and her gifts worthy of you. King Ptolemy replied as follows: Blessed be the day when you return to the land of your ancestors and ascended to their throne. I will without delay do for you as you have proposed. But meet me in Ptolemais. There we shall see one another, and I will receive you as my son-in-law, as you have requested. Ptolemy left Egypt with his daughter Cleopatra in the year 162 and arrived at Ptolemais. Alexander went to meet him, and Ptolemy gave him his daughter Cleopatra and celebrated her wedding with great splendor, as kings do. King Alexander also wrote to Jonathan to come and meet him. So Jonathan went to Ptolemais with great pomp and met the two kings. Then he gave them and their friends much silver and gold and many other gifts. The renegades, the pest of Israel, gathered together to accuse Jonathan, but the king paid no attention to them. The king even gave orders that Jonathan remove his garment and be clothed in purple, and it was done. The king also seated him by his side and said to his captains, Go with him into the center of the city and proclaim that no one is to accuse Jonathan under any pretext, and no one is to molest him for any reason. When his accusers saw the public honor given to Jonathan, and that he was clothed in purple, they all fled. The king did him great honor and enrolled him among his first friends and appointed him general and governor. So Jonathan returned to Jerusalem happy and secure. In the year 165, Demetrius, the son of Demetrius, returned from Crete to the land of his ancestors. When King Alexander heard of it, he was so greatly disturbed that he returned to Antioch. Demetrius took his general Apollonius, the governor of Coele-Syria, who assembled a large force. He encamped at Jamnia and sent the following message to Jonathan the high priest: Are you the only one who resists our authority? And am I to be ridiculed because of you? Why do you stand against our authority in your mountains? If you have confidence in your forces, come down to the plain and let us measure each other's strength there, for I have with me the army of the cities. Inquire and find out who I am and who are those who support me. Men will tell you that you cannot resist us, for your fathers were twice defeated on their own land. Now will you be able to withstand the cavalry and so great an army on the plain, where there are no stones or rocks offering a refuge? When Jonathan heard, Apollonius' message, he was greatly aroused. So he left Jerusalem with 10,000 picked men, and his brother Simon came to his help. They encamped near Joppa, but the inhabitants of the city closed the gates to them, as Apollonius had a garrison there. So Jonathan gave the order to attack. The people in the city were so afraid that they opened the gates to him, and Jonathan occupied Joppa. When Apollonius learned of it, he mobilized 3,000 cavalry and a large army. Then he set out towards Azotus, pretending to march through the land, but in fact his troops were spreading out in the direction of the plain, since he had a great number of cavalry on which he relied. Jonathan pursued him towards Azotus, and they began to fight. Apollonius had left 1,000 picked horsemen hidden behind Jonathan, but Jonathan was informed of the ambush. The horsemen surrounded Jonathan's men and shot their arrows from morning till evening. But the Israelites faced them as Jonathan had commanded until the horses of the enemy tired. Once the cavalry were exhausted, Simon and his men advanced and attacked the infantry. The enemy was defeated and fled. The cavalry scattered over the plain, and those who fled went to Azotus, where they entered the temple of Dagon, their idol, to save their lives. But Jonathan set fire to Azotus and the surrounding towns and plundered them. He also burned down the temple of Dagon with all who had taken refuge in it. There were about 8,000 men who either fell by the sword or were burned to death. Jonathan then left for Ascalon, where the inhabitants received him with great honor. From there, Jonathan and his men returned to Jerusalem, laden with booty. When King Alexander heard what had happened, he bestowed new honors on Jonathan. He sent him a golden brooch, which is usually given to the kinsmen of kings. He also gave him Ekron and all its territory as his possession. 1 Maccabees chapter 11. But the king of Egypt assembled an army as numerous as the sands of the seashore, with many ships, for he intended to trick Alexander, take his kingdom, and add it to his own. He went to Syria with words of peace, and the inhabitants of the cities opened their gates to him. They came out to meet him as Alexander had ordered, because Ptolemy was his father-in-law. But as soon as Ptolemy entered the cities, he stationed garrisons in them. When he reached Azotus, he was shown the burnt temple of Dagon, Azotus and its surroundings in ruins, the scattered corpses that had been abandoned, and the charred remains of those whom Jonathan burned to death in the battle, piled in heaps along the king's way. They recounted to King Ptolemy everything Jonathan had done. They were hoping that the king would disapprove, but he said nothing. Jonathan went with great pomp to Joppa to meet the king. They greeted each other and spent the night there. On the following day, Jonathan accompanied the king as far as Eleutherus river and then returned to Jerusalem. King Ptolemy, for his part, seized the coastal cities as far as Seleucia by the sea, for he had made plans against King Alexander. He sent this message to Demetrius: "Come, let us forge an alliance. I will give you my daughter, who was married to Alexander, and you will reign on the throne of your fathers. The fact is, I now regret having given him my daughter, for he has tried to kill me. He accused Alexander because he wanted to take his kingdom. Ptolemy took his daughter away and gave her to Demetrius. In this way, his enmity towards Alexander became public. Ptolemy then entered Antioch and took for himself the crown of Asia. So he held two kingdoms, the kingdom of Egypt and the kingdom of Asia. At that time, Alexander was in Cilicia trying to quell a rebellion. When he heard what had happened, he returned to fight Ptolemy. Ptolemy went out to meet him in battle with a strong army, and Alexander was defeated. As he fled to Arabia and sought refuge there, Sabdiel the Arab cut his head off and sent it to Ptolemy. But after 3 days, Ptolemy died, but immediately the Egyptian soldiers who guarded the fortified cities were killed by the local inhabitants. In this way, Demetrius became king in the year 167. In those days, Jonathan assembled the Jewish army to attack the citadel in Jerusalem, which was occupied by the Syrians, and he prepared many siege engines. But some wicked men who were traitors to their country informed the king. When the king heard of it, he became angry and immediately set out for Ptolemais. From there, he wrote to Jonathan, telling him to stop the siege and to come to see him as soon as possible. Jonathan received the message, but he ordered the siege to continue. Then he decided to risk himself and went to see the king with the elders and priests of Israel. Bringing gold, silver, fine garments, and other presents, they went before the king in Ptolemais and won him over. Some traitors accused them, but the king, in the presence of all his friends, treated Jonathan as kings before had treated him. He confirmed Jonathan's office as high priest with all the privileges he already had, and he numbered him among his first friends. Jonathan asked the king to exempt Judea and the 3 districts of Samaria from taxes, and promised him 300 talents in return. The king agreed and wrote to Jonathan regarding the matter in these terms: King Demetrius to Jonathan, to his brothers, and to the whole Jewish nation, peace. We are sending you a copy of the letter we have written to our kinsman Lasthenes, that you may know. King Demetrius greets his kinsman Lasthenes. Because of their fidelity to us, we have decided to grant favors to the Jewish nation, who are our friends and who fulfill their obligations to us. We wish to reward their fidelity. We confirm the possession of the territory of Judea and the 3 regions of Aphraim, Kedah, and Ramathaim, which have been annexed to Judea from Samaria, with all their dependencies. To all who go up to Jerusalem to offer sacrifice, we grant exemption from the tax the king formerly received from them annually until now, from the produce of the soil and from the fruit of the trees. In the same way, they shall also be exempt from the other taxes due to us, especially from the taxes on the produce of the salt mines and the gold crowns they formerly offered us. None of these privileges shall ever be annulled. Have ye a copy of this decree made and delivered to Jonathan to be displayed on the holy mountain in a conspicuous place. King Demetrius was able to place the kingdom under his rule, and no one dared oppose him. So he dismissed his army, sent all the men back to their homes, except the foreign troops he had recruited from the islands of the pagans. And this drew the hatred of all the troops who had served his fathers. Then Trypho, one of Alexander's former supporters, took advantage of the army's discontent with Demetrius. He went to Lamleku, the Arab, who was in charge of the education of Antiochus, the son of Alexander. Trypho persuaded him to hand the boy over to him in order to restore Antiochus to the throne of his father. He told him of all the decisions of Demetrius and the resentment of his soldiers towards him, and Trypho spent a long time there. Meanwhile, Jonathan asked King Demetrius to withdraw the troops from the citadel in Jerusalem and to call back the garrisons from the fortresses, since they were always fighting Israel. Demetrius answered him, "Not only will I do this for you and for your people, but as soon as I have the occasion to do so, for the present, you would do well to send me reinforcements, for all my soldiers have deserted me." Jonathan sent off 3,000 valiant men to Antioch. They presented themselves before the king, and this made him very happy. About 120,000 rebel inhabitants gathered at the center of the city, intending to do away with the king. Demetrius took refuge in the palace, while the residents occupied the streets of the city and began to attack. The king then called on the Jews to help him, and the Jews rallied round him. Then they spread out throughout the city and killed 100,000 men on that day. They burned the city, seized a great deal of plunder, and saved the king. The Jews took control of the city, and the inhabitants were so discouraged that they begged the king, "Forgive us and stop the Jews from maltreating us and the city." They threw down their arms and made peace. With this, the Jews merited the admiration of the king, and they became famous throughout the kingdom. Then they returned to Jerusalem, laden with booty. But when Demetrius felt secure on his throne and the land was in peace, he forgot his promises and changed his attitude towards Jonathan. He did not treat him with the same kindness as he had done before, but began to treat him very harshly. After this, Trypho came back with Antiochus, who was still a boy. He was proclaimed and crowned king, and the troops discharged by Demetrius rallied to him and fought against Demetrius, who had to flee. Trypho seized the elephants and occupied Antioch. Then the young Antiochus sent Jonathan this letter: "I confirm your office as high priest and make you governor of 4 districts, and I include you among the friends of the king." He sent him a service of gold plate and granted him the right to drink from gold vessels and to be clothed in purple and wear the golden brooch. He also appointed Jonathan's brother Simon as general from the ladder of Tyre to the frontiers of Egypt. Jonathan then began to make rounds of the region and the cities on the western side of the Euphrates. The whole Syrian army came to his aid. He came to Ascalon, and the inhabitants of that city went out to receive him with full honors. From there he went to Gaza, but the people there closed their gates on him. So Jonathan laid siege to it and burned the suburbs of the city, plundering everything. Then the people of Gaza sought peace, and he made peace with them. But he took the sons of their elders as hostages and sent them away to Jerusalem. Then he travelled through the province until he reached Damascus. Jonathan then received news that the generals of Demetrius were in Kadesh of Galilee with a great army and planned to capture him. Leaving his brother Simon in Judea, he went out to meet them in battle. Simon encamped against Bethsur and laid siege to it for many days. The inhabitants sued for peace, which he granted them, but he expelled them from the city and occupied it and stationed a garrison there. Meanwhile, Jonathan encamped with his army by the waters of Gennesareth. Then early in the morning, they went to the plain of Hazor. The army of the pagans went out to confront them on the plain, after laying the ambush for him in the mountains. As they advanced directly towards the Jews, the men in ambush broke cover and began to attack. The men of Jonathan's side fled, and only Mattathias, the son of Absalom, and Judas, the son of Calphi, the leaders of his army, remained with him. At this Jonathan tore his garments, put dust on his head and prayed. Then he faced his attackers, defeated them, and put them to flight. So the troops who had abandoned him came back to his side, and together they pursued the enemies as far as Kadesh, where the enemy camp was, and there they too pitched camp. About 3,000 pagans perished that day. Then Jonathan returned to Jerusalem. 1 Maccabees, chapter 12. Jonathan saw that circumstances were to his advantage, so he chose men and sent them to Rome to confirm and renew the alliance of friendship with the Romans. He also sent letters to the Spartans and to other places for this same purpose. Those who went to Rome entered the Senate and delivered this message: "The high priest Jonathan and the Jewish nation have sent us to renew with you the friendship and alliance that formerly united us." The Senate gave them letters of recommendation to the authorities of each region, enabling them to journey safely back to the land of Judah. This is a copy of the letter Jonathan wrote to the Spartans. Jonathan, high priest, the senate of the nation, the priests and the whole country of the Jews, to the people of Sparta, their brothers, peace. In the past, our high priest Onias received from Araios, your king, a letter stating that you are indeed our brothers, as the enclosed copy attests. Onias received the envoy with great honor and accepted the letter, which clearly spoke of friendship and alliance. Though we are not in need, for we have our consolation in our sacred books, we have decided to send ambassadors to you to renew our fraternal bonds and friendship, in order not to become strangers to you, for it has been a long time since you wrote us. For our part, we constantly remember you in all circumstances, on special days, in the sacrifices we offer, as well as in our prayers. For it is but right and proper to remember our brothers and greatly rejoice at your prosperity and fame. For our part, we have been involved in many trials, in misery and wars, for neighboring kings have attacked us. However, we did not want to be a burden to you or to the rest of our allies and friends during these wars, for our help comes from heaven. Finally, we have been freed from our enemies, who have been humbled. So we have chosen Numenius, son of Antiochus, and Antipater, son of Jason, and sent them to the Romans to renew our former friendship and alliance with them. So we have chosen Numenius, son of Antiochus, and Antipater, son of Jason, and sent them to the Romans to renew our former friendship and alliance with them. We have also ordered them to go to you, greet you, and deliver this letter to you on our behalf, with which we wish to renew our alliance. We shall be glad to receive a favorable response. This is a copy of the letter which Onias had received. Araios, king of the Spartans, to Onias the high priest. We have found in one of our documents that the Spartans and the Jews are brothers, for both are of the race of Abraham. Now that we have come to know this, we shall be grateful if you send us news of your welfare. And we say this to you: our livestock and our possessions are yours, and similarly all that are yours are ours. This is what we have instructed our envoys to say to you. Jonathan learned that the generals of Demetrius come to attack him with a larger army than before. So he left Jerusalem at once and went to face them in the country of Hamath, so as not to give them time to invade his own land. He sent spies to their camp, and on their return, they told him that the enemy planned to attack them during the night. So at sunset, Jonathan ordered his men to keep watch throughout the night with their weapons at hand, ready to fight, and he posted guards around the camp. When the enemies learned that Jonathan was keeping watch with his troops and ready for battle, they were afraid and discouraged. For this reason, they kindled fires in their camp and fled. But neither Jonathan nor his army knew of their withdrawal until morning, for they saw the fires burning the whole night. Jonathan pursued them, but was not able to catch up with them, for they had crossed the Eleutherus river. So Jonathan went back against the Arabs, called Sabadeans, defeated them and plundered them. After breaking camp, he went to Damascus and travelled throughout the region. Meanwhile, Simon had also set out and gone as far as Ascalon and the neighboring fortresses. He then proceeded to Joppa and occupied it, for he had heard that the inhabitants of that city planned to hand the citadel over to the supporters of Demetrius, and he stationed a garrison there to hold it. On returning, Jonathan summoned the elders of the people. The assembly decided to build fortresses in Judea, to make the walls of Jerusalem still higher, and to erect a barrier between the citadel and the city, to separate it from the city and to isolate it and prevent its defenders from going out to buy or sell. They also held an assembly to rebuild the city. Part of the wall over a rushing stream had fallen, and they built up a new wall they called Kaptenatha. Simon rebuilt Adida in the Shephelah, fortified it, and erected barred gates in it. Trypho wanted to reign in Asia and to do away with King Antiochus in order to be king himself, but he feared that Jonathan might not allow him to do so, and might even come to attack him. he set out and came to Bethshan. At once Jonathan went out to meet him with 40,000 men, and he too came to Bethshan. When Trypho saw that Jonathan had come with a large army, he was afraid to begin the assault. So he received Jonathan with honor, presented him to all his friends, gave him gifts, and instructed friends and his troops to obey Jonathan as they obeyed him. Then he asked Jonathan, "Why have you bothered to come with so many men? Are we perhaps enemies? Send them back to their homes and remain here with some of them. Then you will come with me to the city of Ptolemais, because I wish to hand it over to you, as well as the other fortresses, and to place the rest of the troops and their officers at your disposal. Then I will return home, for I have come only for this." Jonathan believed him and did as Trypho had asked him. He dismissed his men, who then returned to the land of Judea, and 3,000 men remained with him. Of these he left 2,000 in Galilee, and only 1,000 accompanied him. But as soon as they had entered Ptolemais, the inhabitants closed the gates. They seized him and killed all who had come with him. Trypho sent troops and cavalry to Galilee, unto the great plain, to wipe out all of Jonathan's men. On receiving the news that Jonathan and his companions had been seized and killed, his soldiers encouraged one another and prepared to face their pursuers. When their enemies saw them ready to fight for their lives, they turned back. So the men of Jonathan reached the land of Judea safe and sound. They wept for Jonathan and his companions, and they were discouraged, and all Israel was in mourning. Then all the neighboring nations planned to destroy them on seeing that they were now without leader or ally. And the pagans said, "This is now the opportunity to wipe out the remembrance of them from humankind." 1 Maccabees chapter 13. Simon heard that Trypho had assembled a great army to invade Judea and devastate it. As the people were frightened and apprehensive, he went up to Jerusalem. There he called the people together and encouraged them with this exhortation: "All of you know what I, my brothers, and the family of my father have done for the laws and for the holy place. You also know the wars and the hardships we endured. All my brothers died for Israel, and now I alone am left. God forbid that I should seek my own safety when things go wrong, for my life is not of more worth than the lives of my brothers. Now that all the nations have united in their hatred in order to destroy us, I will defend my nation and the holy place, your wives and your children." All were encouraged with these words, and they exclaimed in a loud voice, "Be our leader in place of Judas and your brother Jonathan. Lead us in the war, and we will obey your commands." So Simon assembled all the men able to fight, and hastened to finish building the walls of Jerusalem, which was fortified on all sides. Then he sent Jonathan, son of Absalom, with a strong army to Joppa. They drove out those who occupied it and remained there. Meanwhile, Trypho left Ptolemais with a large army to invade Judea, taking Jonathan with him as prisoner. Simon encamped in Adida facing the plain. But when Trypho learned that Simon had taken command in place of his brother Jonathan and was prepared to fight him, he sent some envoys to him with this message: "We have in our custody your brother Jonathan, because of the money he owes to the royal treasury for the offices he held. So send 100 talents of silver and 2 of his sons as hostages, lest he slip away when we release him and come back against us. Then we shall let him go." Simon knew that Trypho was deceiving him, but he still sent for the money and the boys, so as not to draw upon himself the anger of the people of Israel, who might say, "They killed Jonathan because Simon refused to send Trypho the money and the boys." He therefore sent the boys and the 100 talents, but Trypho broke his word and did not set Jonathan free. After this, Trypho advanced to invade Judea and plunder it. He moved along the way to Adora, but Simon and his army kept confronting him wherever he went. Then the men in the citadel sent messengers to Trypho, urging him to come at once to their rescue by way of the desert and to bring them food. Trypho prepared his entire cavalry to go, but it snowed so heavily that night that he was unable to go. So he left for Gilead, and when he approached Bascama, he killed Jonathan and buried him there. Then Trypho returned to his own land. Simon sent men to look for the remains of Jonathan his brother, and he buried him in Modin, the city of their fathers. All Israel deeply mourned and wept for Jonathan for many days. Simon built a monument over the tomb of his fathers and brothers, high enough to be seen even from afar, with the back and front covered with marble. He erected 7 pyramids facing each other for his father and mother and his 4 brothers. He surrounded the pyramids with great columns, and he had trophies of arms carved upon the columns as a lasting remembrance. And beside the armor, sculptured ships were to be seen by all who sailed the sea. This is the tomb he constructed in Modin, and it is still there today. Trypho treated the young king Antiochus in bad faith and put him to death. He then made himself king in his place, put on the crown of Asia, and caused great havoc in the country. Now Simon rebuilt the fortresses of Judea, surrounded them with high towers and great walls with barred gates, and stored food in them. Simon chose men whom he sent to King Demetrius in his attempt to obtain tax exemption for the region, on the grounds that all that Trypho did was to plunder. King Demetrius responded favorably to his request and wrote to him as follows: "King Demetrius, greet Simon, high priest and friend of the king, the elders and the Jewish nation. We have received the golden crowns and the palm you have sent us, and we are disposed to make a lasting peace with you, and to write to the officials to grant you remission of your debts. All our concessions in your favor are definitive, and the fortresses you have built are yours. Moreover, we pardon all errors and offenses committed to this day, as well as the crown tax you owe. From now on, any other tax that used to be paid in Jerusalem shall no longer be collected. If any of your men are qualified to enlist in our army, they can do so, and let peace reign between us." So, in the year 170, Israel became free from the yoke of the pagans. They began to write in their documents and contracts, "In the first year of Simon, high priest, general and leader of the Jews." In those days, Simon encamped against Gaza and surrounded it with his army. He constructed a mobile tower, brought it up to the city, attacked and occupied one tower. Then the men of the mobile tower entered the city, causing great dismay. The inhabitants, with their wives and children, went up on the walls, tore their garments, cried out in a loud voice to Simon, and sought peace. They said to him, "Treat us not as our wickedness deserves, but according to your mercy." Simon was reconciled with them and did not treat them according to the rigor of war, but he expelled them from the city and purified the house where idols were kept. He then entered the city singing hymns of thanksgiving. After cleansing it from all its impurity, he settled in it men who observed the law. He fortified it and built a house there for himself. The men who occupied the citadel in Jerusalem could no longer come out or go into Jewish territory to buy or sell. So they were desperately in need of food, many of them dying of hunger. They begged Simon for peace, and he granted it to them, but he expelled them from there and cleansed the citadel from all that reminded them of the presence of the pagans. On the 23rd day of the second month of the year 171, the Jews entered it with songs and palm branches to the accompaniment of cithars, cymbals, and harps, and with hymns and songs, for a great plague has been crushed and removed from Israel. Simon decreed that this day be celebrated as a day of annual rejoicing. He strengthened the fortifications of the temple hill by the side of the military citadel and dwelt there with his men. John, son of Simon, had come to manhood, so his father appointed him general in command of all the troops, and John lived in Gaza. First Maccabees, chapter 14. In the year 172, King Demetrius assembled his army and marched into Media to look for help in order to fight Trypho. Artaxerxes, king of Persia and Media, heard that Demetrius had entered his territory. So he sent one of his generals to capture him alive. The general went and defeated the army of Demetrius, seized him, and brought him to Artaxerxes, who put him in prison. Judea had peace as long as Simon lived. He worked for the well-being of his country. His rule pleased the people, and he enjoyed much renown as long as he lived. To add to his glory, he took Joppa and made it a harbor, opening a way to communicate with the islands of the sea. He extended the frontiers of his land and was lord of his nation. He brought back many captives, conquered Gazad, Bethsur, and the citadel, and cast out everything pagan that was in it. No one was able to resist him. The inhabitants tilled their fields in peace. The land gave its grain, and the trees their fruit. The elders sat at ease in the squares and talked of their welfare, while the young men wore finery and armor. He supplied the cities with food and made them into strongholds until his fame spread out to the ends of the earth. He established peace in the land, and Israel knew great joy. Each one sat under the shade of his vine and his fig tree, with no one to disturb him. There was no one in the land to fight them, for the kings had been defeated. He raised up the humble among his people. He observed the law and cleared out the renegades and the wicked. He restored the splendor of the temple and increased the number of its sacred vessels. When the news of Jonathan's death reached Rome and Sparta, these people too were deeply grieved. But as soon as they heard that his brother Simon had succeeded him as high priest and was in command of the country and the cities in it, they wrote to him on bronze sheets to renew the alliance and friendship they had made with his brothers Judas and Jonathan. The letter was read in Jerusalem before the whole assembly. This is a copy of the letter sent by the Spartans. The leaders and the people of Sparta to Simon, high priest, and to the elders, to the priests and to all the Jewish people, their brothers, greetings. The envoys you sent our people informed us of the successes and prosperity of your nation. We rejoiced at their coming. We have recorded their declaration in our public acts as follows. Numenius, son of Antiochus, and Antipater, son of Jason, ambassadors of the Jews, have come to renew their relationship with us. It has been a pleasure for the people to receive them with honor and deposit a copy of their statement in the public archives as a remembrance for the people of Sparta. And they made a copy of all this for the high priest Simon. After this, Simon sent Numenius to Rome with a large gold shield weighing 1,000 minas to confirm their alliance with the Romans. When the people came to know these events, they said, "What favor can we do for Simon and his sons? It was he and his brothers and the family of their fathers who strengthened the resistance. They have fought the enemies of Israel and restored its freedom." So they engraved an inscription on bronze sheets and set it up on pillars on Mount Zion. This is a copy of the text. On the 18th day of the month, Elul, in the year 172, the third year of Simon the high priest, in the grand assembly of the priests of Israel, the leaders of the nation and the elders of the people, the following was proclaimed. During the frequent wars for freedom in our land, Simon, son of Mattathias, a priest from the family of Joarib, and his brothers risked their lives and stood up against the enemies of their nation to preserve the holy place and the law, and brought eternal glory to their nation. Jonathan rallied the nation and became the high priest, and then rested with his fathers. The enemies of the Jews then planned to invade their land in order to destroy their holy place. So Simon arose to fight for his nation. He spent much of his own wealth to procure arms and to pay the salary of the soldiers of his nation. He fortified the cities of Judah and Bethsur on the frontiers of Judea, where the enemy arsenal had been, and he stationed a Jewish garrison there. He also fortified Joppa by the sea, and Gazzara on the borders of Azotus, which was formerly inhabited by enemies, and established Jewish colonies there, providing them with all they needed. The people saw Simon's faith and the glory he had resolved to win for his nation. They made him their commander and high priest because of the services he rendered, the justice and faithfulness he showed to his nation, and because he sought in every way to increase the honor of his people. In his days, Jews managed to root out the pagans from their land, especially from the city of David, Jerusalem, where they had built a citadel from which they went out to profane the surroundings of the temple and to violate its holiness. He settled Jewish soldiers in it and fortified it for the security of the region and the city, and built the walls of Jerusalem higher. And for this, King Demetrius confirmed him in his office as high priest, made him one of his friends, and bestowed high honors on him, for he had heard that the Romans had considered the Jews their friends, allies, and brothers, and had received Simon's envoy with honor. The king also took into account that the Jews and the priests had agreed that Simon be their leader and high priest until a prophet worthy of trust appeared. They wanted him to be their general and take charge of the holy place, and to appoint men to supervise the works, to administer the country, the army, and the fortresses. They also wanted everyone to obey him, that all documents of the nation bear his name, and that he be clothed in purple and wear golden ornaments. None of the people or the priests shall be allowed to act contrary to these provisions, or contradict his orders, or convene a public assembly without his consent, or be clothed in purple, or wear the golden brooch. Whoever opposes these decisions or violates any of these shall be liable to punishment. All the people agreed to grant Simon the right to act in accordance with these provisions, and Simon accepted and agreed to assume the office of high priest and to be the general and leader of the Jews and of the priests, and to preside over all. They decided that this decree be engraved on bronze sheets and set up in a conspicuous place in the sacred enclosure, and that copies be deposited in the temple treasury and made available to Simon and his sons. 1 Maccabees chapter 15. Antiochus, son of King Demetrius, sent from the islands of the sea to Simon, the high priest and leader of the Jews, and to the whole nation the following letter. King Antiochus to Simon, high priest and leader, and to the Jewish nation, peace. Since wicked men have seized the kingdom of our ancestors, I now intend to recover it and to re-establish it as it was before. I have gathered a very large army and have equipped warships to make a landing in the country and take revenge on those who devastated our land and laid waste many cities in my kingdom. Now therefore, I confirm in your regard all the tax exemptions and all other privileges granted you by my royal predecessors. I authorize you to mint your own coinage for your nation. I accept the autonomy of Jerusalem and the holy place. all the arms you have manufactured, as well as the fortresses you have constructed, and those you have occupied are yours. From this day on, I cancel all debts to the king, and everything you may owe in the future. And when I have taken possession of my kingdom, I shall bestow great honors on you, your nation, and on the temple, making you famous throughout all the earth. In the year 174, Antiochus marched out to the land of his ancestors, and all the troops rallied to him, so that only a few remained with Trypho. Antiochus pursued him, and Trypho took refuge in Dor on the coast. Trypho knew how critical the situation had become for him, and that his army had deserted him. Antiochus encamped before Dor with 120,000 soldiers and 8,000 horsemen, and he surrounded the city while the ships attacked from the sea. The city was completely surrounded by land and sea, and no one could go in or come out. Then Numenius and his companions arrived from Rome, carrying letters addressed to the kings and to the nations in the following terms: Lucius, consul of the Romans, to King Ptolemy, peace. The Jewish people sent by the high priest Simon and by the Jewish people have come to us as our friends and allies to renew our friendship and alliance of old. They have brought us a gold shield weighing 1,000 minas. It is our desire to write to the kings and the peoples that they should not harm the Israelites, nor injure them or their cities or their land, nor ally themselves with their aggressors. We have accepted with pleasure the shield that the Jews sent us. Now, if some wicked Jews who have fled from their land are in your country, hand them over to the high priest Simon, that he may punish them according to their law. The same letter was sent to King Demetrius, to Attalus, Ariarathes, and Arsaces, and to all the nations, to Samsamis, the Spartans, Delos, Mindos, Sicyon, Caria, Samos, Pamphylia, Lycia, Halicarnassus, Rhodes, Phasaelis, Kos, Side, Aradus, Gortina, Credus, Cyprus, and Cyrene. They also sent copies of these letters to the high priest Simon. King Antiochus encamped before Dor in the new district, continually sending his battalions against it and constructing siege engines. He kept Trypho shut in and prevented him from going out or in. Simon sent him 2,000 picked men to help him in the fight with silver, gold, and plenty of equipment. But Antiochus did not accept them. Instead, he annulled the concessions he had granted to Simon and declared him his enemy. He sent Athenobius, one of his friends, to him in order to meet him and say to him, "You have occupied Joppa, Gassara, and the citadel of Judea, which are cities of my kingdom. You have laid waste their territory and done great damage in the land, and have seized many towns in my kingdom. Restore then the cities you have seized, and the taxes of the places you now occupy beyond the borders of Judea, or pay me 500 talents of silver as compensation for the damage you have caused, and another 500 talents for the taxes of the cities. If not, then I shall declare war against you." Athenobius, the friend of the king, arrived in Jerusalem, and when he saw the magnificence of Simon, his plates of gold and silver, and the pomp that surrounded him, he was amazed. But he delivered the king's message. Simon answered him, "We have not occupied any foreign land, nor seized any foreign property. This is the inheritance of our ancestors. It was our enemies who seized this for some time, but now that we have a favorable opportunity, we are only recovering the inheritance of our ancestors. Joppa and Gassara, which you claim, did great harm to our people and laid waste our land. But we are prepared to give you 100 talents for them." Athenobius did not say anything, but went back to the king very angry and reported to him Simon's reply. He also told him of Simon's magnificence and everything he had seen. So the king became furious. Meanwhile, Trypho fled to Orthosia on a ship. The king appointed Sendebeus as general and gave him part of the troops and the horsemen. He ordered him to encamp against Judea, rebuild Kedron, and fortify its gates, and make war on the people. The king then went on pursuing Trypho. Sendebeus arrived at Jamnia and began to disturb the people. He invaded Judea, imprisoned some people, and put them to death. He fortified Kedron, stationed horsemen and troops there to make sorties and to patrol the roads to Judea, as the king had commanded him. 1 Maccabees chapter 16. At that time, John went up from Gassara to relate to his father what Sendebeus was doing. So Simon called his 2 elder sons, John and Judas, and said to them, "I and my brothers and the family of my father have fought the enemies of Israel from our youth until today, and many times we were able to liberate Israel. But now I am old, while you, thanks be to heaven, are already mature men. Take my place and my brothers, and go out to fight for our country. May heaven's help be with you." Then he chose 1,000 men and horsemen from the country whom he sent against Sendebeus, and they spent the night in Modin. They arose early in the morning and advanced into the plain, and saw what a large army, both infantry and cavalry, was coming to meet them. A stream lay between them, and John with his troops drew up against the enemies. His troops were afraid to cross the stream, so he crossed over first. On seeing this, his men crossed after him. He divided his army into 2 groups and set the horsemen in the center, for the enemy's cavalry was very numerous. They sounded the trumpet, and Sendebeus and his army were defeated. Many of them fell, and those who remained fled to the fortress. Judas, the brother of John, fell wounded, but John pursued his enemies until Sendebeus reached Kedron, which he had fortified. The enemy fled as far as the towers in the fields of Azotus, but John burned these down. About 2,000 of the enemy perished. And after this, John returned safely to Judea. Ptolemy son of Ahubos, had become general in command of the plain of Jericho. He had much silver and gold, besides being the high priest's son-in-law. He became too ambitious and thought of becoming the leader of his nation. So he looked for ways to do away with Simon and his sons. Simon was then making the rounds of the cities of Judea and attending to their administration. In the 11th month, called Shebat, in the year 177, Simon came to Jericho with his two sons, Mattathias and Judas. The son of Ahubos received them treacherously into the small fortress called Dog, which he had built. He gave them a grand banquet, but had set men in hiding. When Simon and his sons were drunk, Ptolemy and his men reached for their weapons and rushed on Simon in the midst of the banquet. They killed him with his two sons and some of his servants. With this, Ptolemy committed a great act of treachery, repaying evil for good. Ptolemy then made haste to send a letter to the king to inform him of what had happened, asking Antiochus to help him in handing over to him the cities and the country. He also sent other men to Gazzara in order to kill John, and asked the commanders of the Jewish troops in a letter to defect to him, promising them silver, gold, and gifts. He then sent others to seize Jerusalem and the Temple Hill. But a man ran and reached Gazzara before them, informing John that his father and brothers had been killed. And he added, "He has also sent some people to kill you." John was shocked by the news. So he arrested the men who had been sent to kill him and put them to death, for he knew that they had come with this purpose. The rest of the deeds of John, his battles, his exploits, the walls he built, and all his other achievements are written in the annals of his pontificate from the day he succeeded his father as high priest.